Before I get into this lecture, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that the audio is going to sound probably of much lower quality from this point in the semester until the end. Unfortunately, the microphone I'd been using, the USB cable, has malfunctioned, and so it is no longer operational. So I am relying solely on my computer microphone, and quite frankly, it's just not that awesome. So my apologies if you have any questions about anything you're hearing or you're unable to understand something, please let me know. So lecture 10 focuses on coping with conflict. And we tend to associate conflict with fighting and yelling, but it's important to know that conflict doesn't always have to be negative. It's actually a very common experience in all types of relationships. Really, the most important thing is managing conflict effectively when it does arise. Conflict management, in fact, is a relationship maintenance strategy, which you may remember from one of the previous units. And being able to manage conflict helps us to maintain a relationship and keep it in a satisfactory condition. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about in this particular unit. Interpersonal conflict is just broadly defined as an expressed struggle that occurs when two interdependent people cannot agree on a way to meet their needs or goals. So in other words, there are two people in a given interaction. Each person has a set of goals that they're trying to achieve, but those goals are incompatible or in conflict with one another. And so, of course, it makes it hard for both people to meet those goals simultaneously. So, for example, you might have conflicted with your parents over your curfew when you were younger. So you wanted to stay out with your friends, and your parents wanted to make sure that you're safe. So they wanted you to be home at a certain time to make sure you weren't getting in any kind of trouble. Those are two conflicting goals. You may be also conflicted with your siblings or your parents about issues related to privacy, and maybe those conflicts are still occurring if you still live with family members. So you want to keep what you're doing private, but your parents want to make sure, again, you're safe and obeying their rules, or maybe they just generally want information. They don't trust you for some reason. Another example, married and cohabiting couples may conflict over having children, or they may conflict over something, less important than that, like just household responsibilities. Dating couples may conflict over how to spend the weekend or how much time they should spend with one another. So in each of these examples, the two parties had different competing goals, and those goals just couldn't be met simultaneously, and that's where the struggle occurs. My first question before I get into kind of what conflict really is in terms of an interpersonal situation, can you think of a relationship where you have never experienced disagreement to some extent? I'm willing to bet every single person in here is saying no, and that's because conflict is inevitable. It's necessary to resolve issues in relationships. Parents, for example, are going to have a hard time giving a teenage kid freedom if the kid doesn't express frustration with some of the rules of the household. Friends with benefits relationships. At some point, you may have to engage in conflict to figure out the best way to navigate that relationship so that each person's needs are being met. Maybe that involves a conversation about the rules of the relationship. And, it doesn't have to be an argument. And there are many outcomes here. So it might open up the ability to communicate more effectively in that relationship, or maybe it ends with the two people deciding to end it. So it's not inherently bad. Conflict is not inherently a bad thing, and it actually does have many positive effects or positive outcomes. Now, it's most likely to occur in close relationships, and in fact, married couples report most conflict, but also the most closeness. And this is because it's highly associated with interdependence. Remember, we talked about how it's an expressed struggle between two interdependent parties. So as relational partners become more committed, they also become more interdependent, and that then can lead to more struggles. Now, too much conflict in a relationship may reflect relational problems, but like I said before, some level of conflict is normal and healthy in close relationships. It's really more about the way we manage conflict that's more important than the frequency of the conflict. People use a variety of strategies or styles to deal with conflicts in their various relationships. And the conflict styles can be distinguished by focusing on two dimensions. The first is cooperation. So this is the extent to which you take your own and the other person's goals into account versus just trying to win the argument. And the second dimension is directness. This is the extent to which you engage in the conflict or avoid the conflict. You can see the two different dimensions here in this graphic. So the directness dimension is on the left, and the cooperation dimension runs along the bottom of the table. Two differences from what you might have discussed in another course, specifically COM 1000, is that we have split the competing conflict style into two different styles of competitive fighting and indirect fighting. And then we're also going to call the accommodating style yielding, because we're actually going to talk about accommodation as a conflict management strategy. So if you look at the two dimensions, the uncooperative but direct conflict style is competitive fighting. The uncooperative but indirect style is indirect fighting. And then moving across the table, the most cooperative and the most direct is collaborating, while the most cooperative but least direct is yielding. And everything else is in between. So we'll take a look at each of these separately. We'll start with yielding. So yielding or accommodating is a non-assertive conflict style. So this is where you are sort of putting aside your own needs to please your partner. It often involves passively accepting the partner's decisions. The advantage of this style is it doesn't cause further disagreement or it doesn't escalate the issue, but it's problematic because it often ignores differences or downplays disagreements. So conflict management then can be quite difficult. People yield for a number of reasons. So maybe something just isn't worth arguing over. You've probably heard the phrase pick your battles before. That's an example there. You may decide the other person has a good point, or maybe you're willing to accept the fact that they do in fact know better than you. So there are reasons to yield in a conflict situation. It can also be the result of what we call the chilling effect. This is where you avoid voicing your opinions or concerns or complaints because you feel threatened in some way. So people are likely to avoid voicing their opinions and concerns when they feel powerless or they fear their partner will act aggressively toward them. So that's where yielding can be especially problematic. There may be a power imbalance in the relationship. So yielding is sometimes appropriate, but it's generally ineffective. It only really works when you are not invested in the topic or the two parties can't agree on a decision, but they need to make a decision. So for example, you might have an argument about who is going to do the dishes, and then one person just finally gives in because they don't want the dishes to attract flies or to smell. So you just kind of yield and accept the fact that if the other person's not going to do the dishes, you're going to have to do it. One disadvantage or limitation of yielding is that you're unlikely to achieve personal goals, which could strain the relationship, especially if one person is consistently yielding to the other person, because this puts the yielder in a powerless position. So this tends to be described as a win-lose situation. One person wins the conflict and the person who yields is the one who loses. So let's talk through a potentially real life example that you may or may not have had experience with. But I'd be willing to bet that even if this specific example doesn't apply to you, we can all think of a situation where we have fought with someone over what we're going to watch on TV that night. So on Monday evenings, there is a program that I like to watch called Dancing with the Stars, and there's another program that my husband likes to watch, and it's called Monday Night Football. So I'm not saying this is a personal experience or anything like that. I'm just saying maybe this is relevant to you, maybe it's not. So in the yielding conflict style, let's say you're conflicting over what you're going to watch on TV. And so you decide to say, well, you can watch whatever you want and I'll just try and catch my show later. So you can go ahead and watch Monday Night Football and I'll try and watch it online or on demand, or, if you have TiVo, something like that, maybe you can actually record it and watch it at a later time. Now, if it's a result of the chilling effect, it might be something to the effect of, let's say it's a roommate situation and your roommate says to you, well, my parents bought this TV and they're paying the cable bill. So you kind of feel powerless in that situation. You feel maybe a little bit threatened, and so you're more likely to yield to the other person's desires. In the television show The Office, the early seasons, Roy and Pam are actually a great example of yielding. Pam often accommodates Roy and kind of goes along with what he decides or what he thinks is best. And we get a glimpse into perhaps why that might be, but it is sort of hard to determine if it's because maybe she really doesn't care about the various issues, or maybe she thinks Roy knows better than her, or perhaps it's a result of the chilling effect. My guess is it's a result of the chilling effect, but you can make your own interpretations if you're familiar with the program. The second conflict style, another non-assertive approach, is avoiding. So avoiding is indirect, but it's moderately cooperative. Avoiding involves essentially denying the conflict, being indirect and evasive, changing and avoiding topics, acting like you don't care, or joking to avoid the conflict. So in other words, we're sort of physically or psychologically distancing ourselves from the conflict. We're refraining from arguing and refusing to confront the partner in a meaningful way. The avoiding style is fairly common, especially among roommates and dating partners. It is typically inappropriate and ineffective, and often results in a lose-lose situation because you get very little accomplished and nobody really meets their goals. So this is sort of characterized by low concern for both self and other. Avoiding can also come off as dismissive. Now, with that being said, sometimes avoidance can be beneficial. So if the topic is of little importance to both you and the other person, or you agree that the relationship is more important than the issue, maybe you agree to disagree. When both people agree to avoid a topic, that's another situation where avoiding can be beneficial. Or maybe you just want to avoid momentarily or temporarily, and save the discussion for another time. Sometimes, you might need to take a minute to cool off before you actually engage in a meaningful conversation. So a couple of examples, let's say that you're having a conflict or a struggle with a coworker, but you're quitting your job soon, so there's really no point in engaging in the conflict with this person. So you instead avoid the conversation altogether because you're not going to be around and have to deal with that person for much longer. Maybe you find out that your partner believes in ghosts and you think that's a silly thing, but at the same time, you've decided to avoid talking about the topic altogether, so as not to cause any problems, because at the end of the day, who really cares, right? So you avoid that conversation, you avoid the topic. So with our Monday Night Football and Dancing with the Stars conflict example, let's just say you decide to go to a friend's every Monday night so you can watch your program while your partner stays home or your roommate stays home and watches their program of choice. Now, the thing you have to think about, though, is that this TV control situation could be a symptom of a larger problem, like inequity in the relationship, in which case avoiding may not be an appropriate long-term solution because, again, nothing's really getting resolved in the situation. The third conflict style is an assertive approach, although assertive with an asterisk because this is indirect fighting. So indirect fighting is both indirect and uncooperative, but it involves essentially expressing your aggression or your disagreement in an indirect manner, which can shut down the discussion about the conflict altogether. Oftentimes, we call this being passive aggressive. So it's sugar-coated hostility. I like that phrase. I found that in one of the readings. It can be immature, it can be childish, and it includes behaviors like failing to acknowledge or validate your partner's concerns, ignoring them, holding a grudge, whining, giving dirty looks, rolling your eyes, those types of things. So again, comes off as sort of childish, and it really doesn't accomplish anything. What it does do is provoke meta conflict. So meta conflict is basically conflict about conflict. So it's conflict about how people disagree. It's a conflict about how people engage in the disagreement process. And the problem with meta conflict is that it sidetracks partners from discussing the actual issue. So for example, one person says, "Stop talking to me like a child." And then the other person says, "We never get anything done because you never listen to me." So you're not at this point in conflict about the thing you actually disagree about. You're in conflict about how you're engaging in the conflict situation. So not especially productive. And indirect fighting or passive aggression can be especially destructive if you use these behaviors to avoid confronting problems. This style is also associated with many negative outcomes related to competitive fighting. So relationship dissatisfaction and a failure to resolve conflicts, but it can actually be more detrimental to relationships because it's indirect. At least with competitive fighting, you're engaging in direct verbal communication that brings your issues to the forefront. But with indirect fighting, you're really not doing that. So this can lead to relationship decline if there's too much indirect fighting or passive aggression in a relationship. So, for example, when I was writing this lecture, I was pregnant and I was tired all the time. And I was taking a nap one day, and my husband decided to unload the dishwasher, which I think I interpreted as being passive aggressive, but it probably just wasn't. So I woke up, I made a production of sighing very loudly, and he apologized. My dog was also cuddling with me. And so then my husband sat down in the recliner chair, and then he got up a few minutes later and he slammed the footrest. And that actually woke up our dog. So in a very passive aggressive manner, which I'm not proud of, but I'll own up to my faults. I said, "I know, Boomer, no one can take a nap in this house for very long." Right? So that's kind of a crappy thing to say. It's indirect, it's passive aggressive, it's childish, and it doesn't really resolve anything. So indirect fighting results can result in a win-lose situation or a lose-lose situation. But at the end of the day, it's almost always going to result in a lose-lose situation. With our television program example, so let's say you're going to let your partner watch Monday Night Football, but you don't say that. You don't actually have a conversation about it, but you instead make a passive-aggressive comment like, "Well, I might as well get some work done since we know I'm not watching TV tonight," right? And then you kind of roll your eyes and step out of the room. The fourth conflict style, an assertive approach, is competitive fighting. So competitive fighting is direct, but it is uncooperative. Basically, this boils down to trying to control the interaction in a way that gives you more power because your ultimate goal is to win. So, this is having the mindset of my way or the highway. My perspective is better than yours. So what you're doing is you're attempting to achieve a win-lose situation where you win and your partner loses. So this involves behaviors like confrontational remarks, accusations, criticism, threats, name calling, just generally being kind of a nasty person. It is generally inappropriate in terms of treatment of the partner and ineffective in meeting goals, but it can be effective when there's a power differential and you need the other person to comply. Or, so for example, if there's like a conflict between a parent and a child or a boss and an employee, but you need something done and you need that person to just go along with what's happening, that might be an appropriate situation to use competitive fighting. It's also appropriate if expressing anger is justified. So for example, there are situations where one person cheats on the other person. So you would be justified in that case of expressing your concerns in a direct and aggressive manner. I don't think anybody would fault anybody for doing that. Even when one person finally does yield, the desired win-lose outcome is usually temporary, and it actually turns into a lose-lose situation in the end. So as I mentioned previously, competitive fighting and indirect fighting are both associated with relationship dissatisfaction, but this one at least gets the issues out on the table and you engage in the conversation. So with our television example here, you might, instead of yielding or trying to cooperate or something like that, you might say, we literally always watch what you want to watch. In fact, we always do what you want to do because you're such a control freak and you can't stand to let someone else make a decision every once in a while, which is why people hate making plans with you. You don't listen to what anyone else wants to do. So since we watched football literally all day yesterday, I'm watching Dancing with the Stars tonight. That would be an example of competitive fighting. I posted an example from Friends on Husky CT where Monica and Rachel get into a verbal altercation that turns into a physical altercation while Phoebe tries to mediate the situation. The fifth conflict style, it's also an assertive approach, is called compromising. So it is direct and moderately cooperative because there is high concern for both self and other. So compromising involves searching for fair and intermediate positions that satisfies some of both partners' needs. So this is basically like a negotiation. Each person needs to give up something to reach a solution and meet at least some of their goals. So it's kind of a part win, part lose situation. So you've heard people say, meet me halfway here. That would be a compromise. Oftentimes this involves appealing to fairness, suggesting a trade-off. So all in all, you're trying to maximize wins for both people while minimizing losses. So sharing household chores, for example, trading off dinner responsibilities. But, at the end of the day, sometimes that just doesn't work. Compromise just doesn't work because in those situations, the person responsible for making dinner one night might be busy with work or have to work late, right? So it's really only a quick and short-term resolution to conflict. Now, the problem is that most people perceive compromise to be a reasonable and a fair and efficient strategy for managing conflict, but the problem is that it hampers development of creative alternatives. When compromise is seen as unfair, it can lead to dissatisfaction. So if you feel like, for example, you're compromising too much, or if your needs aren't being met, or problems are never truly resolved, compromising is not going to be an effective long-term strategy. So, with watching two competing programs at the same time, maybe you agree to each of you watch your show in different rooms if you have two TVs, or maybe you decide to flip back and forth during commercials, or maybe, week 1 we watch Monday Night Football, week 2 we watch Dancing with the Stars, or you just say nobody gets the TV on Monday nights, right? So everybody's giving up something, everybody's making a sacrifice, so nobody's totally satisfied. So that's the problem with compromising, though it can be a quick and easy short-term solution. And the final conflict style is collaborating. So collaborating is both direct and cooperative. and it's characterized by high concern for self and other. It is solution oriented and focused on problem solving. So you're trying to find creative solutions that satisfy both partners' needs, which means that you are trying to open lines of communication, you're trying to increase information seeking and sharing, and it's effective because it maintains the relationship for future interaction. So this involves expressing agreement, being supportive, accepting responsibility where necessary, working together to brainstorm ideas, soliciting your partner's opinions, and things like that. So this is the most effective and most appropriate strategy we have. Now, if only we all had the time to collaborate, right? And we just don't. Collaboration is hard. It's actually so hard that I generally have a hard time coming up with examples, but I did manage to come up with a hypothetical. So let's say you and your sibling, you have a set of chores to do, and those chores have to be done before either of you can leave the house. This is what your parents have said. You can both go out, but you need to accomplish this list of items before either of you can leave. Now, you could divide and conquer, right? So you could say, okay, I'll take these chores, you take those chores. But that's already problematic because how are you going to divide the chores? Are you going to divide based on number? Or are you going to divide based on difficulty? Or are you going to divide the chores based on type? Because you could split it down the middle and say, you take these 5 and I'll take these 5, but maybe, one set of 5 is more difficult or takes longer or is more disgusting than the other 5, right? So you're still going to have an argument there. Now, with collaboration, maybe you say, let's tackle the toughest one together first. So maybe one of those tasks is raking the leaves in the yard, right? And so you say, let's share this. Let's do this together. And then once we get through that chore, let's both just go room by room by room and check the things off on this list. So we'll work together the whole time. Because here's the thing, I know when I was growing up, if I had to rake the leaves alone and I knew my sister couldn't leave until I was done, I probably would passive aggressively take my sweet time raking those leaves, right? Just to make her mad. So collaborating is effective because it basically helps you to brainstorm creative strategies where both people win, both people get what they want. So maybe with our television example with Monday Night Football versus Dancing with the Stars, maybe the two of you work together and find a show that you can enjoy together. So you don't watch either of those shows on Monday night. Or maybe you decide let's both pay for a second TV or let's go in on a TiVo account or something like that so we can record those programs and watch them at a later date. So I like to ask these questions because I find it interesting when students, they maybe haven't thought about their conflict styles previously, and then when you say, okay, how do you engage in conflict? What do you think your conflict style is? And I've had a few people say it kind of depends on the relationship. So do you think you have a different conflict style in romantic relationships versus friendships versus family relationships, or do you think you generally fight the same way across situations, right? So are you just overall quick to yield, or do you have a short fuse and maybe competitive fighting is your go-to? So that's something interesting to think about and just sort of engage in self-reflection. Unfortunately, some people just don't have the communication skills necessary to engage in constructive conflict resolution. So they may feel helpless or they may feel defensive when conflict arises with others because they just don't know how to respond or to cope with the situation. This may cause them to withdraw from the conflict or, on the other hand, to use even more aggressive behaviors, which can lead to more negative behavior. So one important skill is being able to engage in logical argumentation, which begins with knowing the difference between argumentativeness and verbal aggressiveness. So argumentativeness is confronting conflict directly. It's a style that focuses on logical argument and reason. So you are basically backing up your claims with evidence and reasoning. You're taking a position on an issue, but you're also recognizing areas where there is disagreement. So those who are skilled in argumentation generally do not resort to negative tactics like name calling or accusations, and instead they present their positions in a skilled, clear, and convincing manner. So this boils down to attacking the position that someone takes and not the person. Verbal aggressiveness, on the other hand, is attacking the person and not the position. So your goal is essentially to hurt the other person or to make them look or feel stupid. So teasing, threatening, criticizing, and this could be criticizing their character or even their appearance. And we tend to resort to these tactics when we're unskilled in argumentation. I think it's important to think about these things, especially in our current political climate, right? It's hard to have a productive conversation when we're consistently resorting to name calling, right? So calling people crazy or calling them snowflakes or, calling them liars, that's not going to lead you, that's not going to open the door to a constructive or an effective conversation. Now, obviously, if they are lying, you should point out the fallacies, but maybe just don't call them a liar. Just an example. You should also think about how verbal aggressiveness can lead to more negative behaviors, right? So if you think about it, if you're being attacked personally, how long are you really going to engage in the discussion before you then retaliate, right? So negativity tends to lead to more and more negativity, and that can be problematic. There's an example on Husky CT. It is a series of clips from The View, which I don't watch, but my mother-in-law watches it. And so regularly, Joy Behar and Meghan McCain tend to engage in a number of disagreements, but they're not very productive disagreements. They typically resort to insults and name calling, so you can look at that example of verbal aggressiveness and maybe try to identify areas where if they just used argumentativeness instead, their discussion would have been more productive. Now we know, based on our conversation so far, that people utilize different strategies depending on the situation and the type of conflict. The strategies are not mutually exclusive. So that means you might use more than one strategy over the course of an interaction. So for example, you might start off the interaction engaging in direct and cooperative strategies, but then become increasingly competitive as the interaction continues. So the conflict styles that we just discussed alone don't explain how a conflict interaction unfolds, which is why it's important to also look at common patterns of conflict in relationships. So we know that indirect and competitive fighting usually have negative effects on relationships, but people use those strategies more often than cooperative strategies because of the principle of negative reciprocity. So negative reciprocity is a pattern of conflict in which aggression leads to more aggression. So once one person uses a competitive or indirect fighting, the other person is likely to follow their lead. So hostile behaviors tend to be reciprocated in conflict situations, which is probably why we assume conflict is inherently a bad thing. Negative reciprocity tends to be more common than positive reciprocity for two reasons. The first is that people tend to exhibit more negative than positive emotions in conflict, right? Nobody enjoys fighting with someone else. And two, people perceive their partners to be expressing hostility, even sometimes when they're not. So many things can set off negative reciprocity, including sarcasm, criticizing, calling each other names, yelling, and accusing your partner of things. And there are 3 tactics that specifically tend to escalate negativity in an interaction. The first is gunny sacking. So gunny sacking is storing up old grievances and old complaints and then dumping them on your partner during a conflict. So you don't discuss your concerns or your complaints when they first surface. Instead, you place them in a metaphorical gunny sack, a knapsack, and you present them all at once during a conflict interaction. The second tactic that escalates negativity is kitchen sinking. So instead of storing your complaints to dump on your partner later, you just rehash old arguments when you get into a new argument. So it's kind of like you're saying, well, we're already arguing, so we might as well go back and talk about these things too. Both gunny sacking and kitchen sinking involve multiple attacks, so partners are likely to feel defensive and overwhelmed, which makes it hard to have a productive conversation. And then bringing third parties into an argument. There are at least 3 ways people do this, and they're all problematic. So first of all, you might mention things that the other people say as a form of evidence. And this is really hurtful, and it's hard to defend because your partner can't really, go and confront the person who supposedly made these comments, right? So, for example, you might say, well, your mom agrees that you never take responsibility for your actions. What are you going to do? You're going to go to your mom and say, did you tell this person this about me? That's just going to escalate conflict in a totally different relationship. Bad-mouthing your partner's friends and family is another way to bring third parties into an argument. So you might say something like, it makes sense that you cheated. You're just like your father, right? So that's a kind of crappy comment. And it makes people defensive because now they have to defend themselves and the person that you just attacked. And then we also compare our partner unfavorably to other people. Right? So you might say something like, well, my ex's parents aren't this mean, or my ex never had a problem with this particular thing that I'm doing, right? So all of those things bring another person into the argument, and it's never productive, and it can lead to increased conflict. Another pattern of conflict interaction is demand withdrawal. So this is where one person wants to engage in the conflict, but the other person wants to avoid it. The demander tends to be in a less powerful position, so they're generally dissatisfied with something, but the person withdrawing is usually in a more powerful position and happy with the way things are. So what happens here is that the demander, right, so they're demanding, and then the other person withdraws, but the opposite is true as well. So, well, I'm withdrawing because you're always nagging me. Well, I have to nag you because you're always withdrawing, right? So it's an uncomfortable push and pull, and so it can just lead to more negative interaction. And then finally, let's discuss the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So a researcher named John Gottman has done extensive research on the various causes of divorce, and he identified a particularly destructive pattern of conflict called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And he found that couples who get divorced are likely to exhibit a pattern of 4 specific behaviors, or the behaviors that we call the 4 horsemen. So these behaviors form a cascade, or a sequence, in which each behavior sets off the next. So we start with complaining and criticizing, which triggers contempt and disgust, which triggers defensiveness, which then triggers stonewalling. So we'll look at each of these individually. So the cascade starts when one person complains or criticizes. Now, complaints and criticisms are not exactly the same things. Criticisms attack the person's character or personality, or blame the person for causing a problem. Complaints, hopefully, focus on behaviors and are legitimate behaviors. So some complaints are healthy and necessary. If you think about it, if partners never complain, they'd never be able to improve or change problematic behaviors. But if complaints continue over a long period of time, they can become problematic. Or if they turn into criticisms, or if they are even just perceived as criticisms, it could lead to the next stage, which is feeling contempt and disgust. So there are 5 common complaints So one is complaints that focus on behavior. So focusing on the behavior instead of the person. So for example, you say, stop gloating, stop bragging. So that's something that's okay because it focuses on the person's behavior. Another common complaint is about performance. So maybe you dislike the way your partner does something. So they complain about the way you cooked dinner. My steak was too well done or something like that. Meta complaints involve complaining about the partner's complaining, right? So stop whining and eat your dinner. And then personal characteristics and personal appearance is where we start kind of stepping into the realm of criticism. So if you're attacking the person's character by calling them inconsiderate or something like that, you're really focusing on that person rather than on the behavior itself. And so that can be problematic. And anytime you criticize or complain about someone's personal appearance, things are probably not going to go well for you in the following interactions. So the second step in this process is when complaints are interpreted as criticism, they lead to feelings of disgust and or contempt, which are then communicated to the partner. So disgust, involves saying things like, I've had enough, I'm not going to deal with this anymore. So you're sounding fed up, you're sounding almost repulsed or sickened by the other person and their behavior. And this might lead to making real or empty relational threats, like threatening to leave the partner. Contempt is similar to disgust, but it's a different emotion altogether because it's cold, right? So you're communicating disapproval, disdain, almost like a superiority. So you're looking down your nose at the other person. You're basically saying, I'm better than you. You're worse than me. There's actually a line in the movie The Sandlot, if you all remember, where they're throwing insults back and forth at one another, and one of the kids from the town baseball team says, "You're not good enough to lick the dirt off our cleats." Right? So that's contemptuous. So this involves insults, mocking the other person, being sarcastic, eye rolling. Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones is, I think, the epitome of contempt. This woman is cold, she's detached, she disapproves of basically everyone and everything. We then become defensive when we feel a need to protect ourselves and ward off these personal attacks. So defensiveness involves trying to defend yourself. And it includes a number of behaviors that really don't do anything to help solve the problem or to address the issue. So counter criticizing, that's negative reciprocity. So you criticize me, I'm going to criticize you. Denying blame or responsibility for your involvement in the conflict. And mind reading. So mind reading is when you assume you know your partner's feelings, motives, and behaviors. So, I know you stayed at work late last night just so you don't have to help clean the house for our visitors. You always find a way to avoid any housework, right? So you're making an assumption, you're reading the person's mind and trying to basically accuse them of something that they may or may not actually have done. So this often includes words like always or never. It's problematic because it's often based on jumping to conclusions and overgeneralizations, but it is common in marital relationships, but it's very rarely accurate and usually just escalates the conflict. Now, in some cases, the individual may take responsibility, but only with excuses, right? So saying something like, "You're right, I was avoiding housework because you make me feel stupid when I don't do things your way." So you're kind of almost turning the blame around on the other person. And then we may discount blame by providing sort of a rationalization or a justification for why we engaged in a certain behavior. When people have been attacked and criticized, when they've experienced disgust and contempt, and when they've tried unsuccessfully to defend themselves, they often shut down or withdraw. And so that brings us to stonewalling. So the two people are no longer trying to work things out. because they're both hurt and they're defensive. So this involves disengaging with the other person, walking out, and just generally refusing to communicate. This could also lead to the demand withdraw cycle as well. So if stonewalling persists, relationships will then stagnate, and then the individuals will part ways. There is one tactic in particular that helps couples avoid the four horsemen, and that is accommodation. So accommodation, there are three things to know about accommodation. First, people have a tendency to reciprocate negative behavior. The second is that accommodation occurs when people are able to overcome that initial tendency and actually engage in cooperative communication. And three, couples in satisfying and committed relationships more often use accommodation than couples in uncommitted or dissatisfying relationships. So what is accommodation? Accommodation really is just responding in a conflict interaction, no matter how hard it is to do, responding with positive, validating messages and limiting the number of negative statements made. This is most likely to occur in relationships characterized by high levels of commitment, satisfaction, and trust. But accommodation has its limitations. It can cause problems like power imbalances in the relationship. So the key to successful accommodation may be that it prompts a pattern of positive reciprocity instead of negative reciprocity, where both partners engage in these cooperative strategies. How many do you think, I know you can't answer me, but how many positive interactions do you think it takes to offset the negative in a relationship? What's the ratio of positive to negative interactions in a given relationship to maintain satisfaction and to prevent things from negatively escalating? 5 to 1. So for every one negative interaction, you need to engage in 5 positive interactions or 5 positive communication behaviors to offset the negativity in a given relationship. And this is based on the research of John Gottman. So what I did is I posted a very short video of him talking about this ratio, so you can kind of hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So take a look at that and hear his explanation. And otherwise, this is the end of this particular unit on conflict.